I have been here now for nearly a season, almost all summer, and I feel like I am slowly settling in and learning how things work here at St. Paul's. Don't get me wrong, I'm still very much learning. In fact, I'm so new that I am still operating under the delusion that I can keep my email inbox at 0. I'm not a zero inbox person, so we'll see how long that delusion lasts. But I feel like I am well into the process of learning how things are done here. This process has involved letting go of some of what I picked up in other places, the patterns of doing things that I had previously held on to. For example, at past churches, I have learned that aspects of the service that I thought were like essential, mandatory parts of the service, turns out they might have just been weird liturgical quirks of a place that I was before. I am learning new ways about how ministries can be led and about how teams can be organized. But I'm not letting go of everything. I'm also bringing some of the things with me, the ideas and practices from past places that I can bring here to enrich our lives together. For example, one of the things that we're doing is we're in the process of revamping how we welcome newcomers to our church. And I've been able to bring past experience from churches that do that really well to try to implement them here, and I've also been able to bring my perspective as a new person here. When I started a couple months ago, we were just beginning to live into our seasonal theme for the summer, for the season after Pentecost, which is Spirit within, love beyond. This is the final Sunday that here at St. Paul's we are living into that theme, because next week we will move into the season of creation, which will have a new theme and a new way of living into that for the next couple months. But so far, my time here has all been in this season after Pentecost, and I have discovered that Spirit within, love beyond, involves listening and discerning what the Spirit inside of me, inside of you, our prayer and our worship and our service, what that Spirit is saying. It involves following that Spirit wherever it leads, even when it's to new and unexpected paths. This is calling us to stretch ourselves, to love others beyond our own comfort zones. I think Reverend Krista described this theme really well in her epistle article way back in beginning of June. Krista wrote, "It's a call to notice the Spirit already at work within us and to follow where it leads, even when the road shifts. We see that Spirit in our deepening commitment to inclusion and in our honest reflection on what ministry looks like now, not just what it used to be. It involves change. And changes are uncomfortable, sometimes especially so at church. Which is because church, this place, these people, is where we connect with God. Church is where we bear our deepest sorrows and our most exultant joys. At church, the ways that we do things, the pattern of our worship and our fellowship together, they feel like these guardrails that can keep our pathway to God open and stable. So, changing is really hard. I'll give you an example, which is not from here. I subscribe to an online forum of Episcopalians, and on that forum, somebody posted a question saying, "Is your church doing the season of creation?" And that post and all of the answers and comments on it caught my attention because at the time, I was working on our new changed bulletins that we're going to start next week and working on some of the stuff we are going to be doing for the season of creation. One of the answers to that question that somebody asked is, I don't know the tone because it was written text on the internet, but I interpreted it to have a bit of a prickly tone and say, "We stick to the Book of Common Prayer liturgical calendar." And there was a lot of anxiety in the discussion of this post and a lot of pushback that the season of creation is not a liturgical season and it shouldn't be compared to some of our ancient historic seasonal traditions, like having an Advent season or a season of Lent. And there were also a lot of people responding saying, no, the season of creation is not a whole liturgical season. It's just a way that we mark the calendar and a way that we remind ourselves that we are part of creation and have a responsibility toward it. But the whole conversation was full of anxiety about change and newness in our pattern of worship. A lot of people were mentioning how scared they were of changes from the Book of Common Prayer liturgy. And I love the Book of Common Prayer liturgy, but it's not straight up an ancient tradition. Our Book of Common Prayer is from the 1970s. Our words are pretty recent. There were changes recently that led to what we love and hold now. So this whole conversation about change, our texts this morning, and this seasonal theme of spirit within, love beyond, led me to think about a favorite quote of mine by the theologian Jaroslav Pelikan, who wrote, "Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living." I felt myself wanting to sort through which of our ways of doing things are tradition. Which of our ways of doing things are those true guardrails, are real lifelines that connect us to the divine presence? And which other ways of doing things might be traditionalism? Might be practices that we hold on to, which hinder us from seeing new movements of the Spirit. Because the Spirit is constantly changing, constantly making new movements all the time. And it's not just the Spirit. Jesus is making new movements all the time, too. In Luke, the gospel we've been reading this year, Jesus is very often reordering society, or at least telling the people around him how much their society differs from the kingdom of God. And Jesus usually does this at meals. For example, in our gospel today, Jesus was at a fancy banquet at the house of an elite religious and cultural leader. Jesus himself was one of the invited guests. Can you imagine inviting an honored guest to join us here at church, and then to have them stand up here and give you a lecture about how you should be sitting in that pew over there, not the one that you usually sit in? You have it all wrong. Move, get up and move. Jesus is literally shaking things up. But it's not even just the Spirit and Jesus. God makes changes all the time in the Old Testament. We hear about God bringing destruction on his people when they deviate from the plan that was set. We even hear about God canceling destruction, like at Nineveh when he is planning to destroy the whole city, but then people put on sackcloths and all of a sudden everything's good. We heard just a snapshot of that winding and often rocky road that God has with God's people today from Jeremiah. In fact, God changes plans so many times during the Old Testament that in seminary, after I had had my Old Testament class and I went into my theology class, I had a bit of a heated debate with my theology professor about God changing. One of the first things we learned in that class was the doctrine of God, which is who God is, what are the central things we believe about the divine. And a central aspect of the doctrine of God is that God does not change. And I got a little bristled and argued with my professor, saying, look at all of these times in Scripture where it literally says, then God changed his mind. And my professor skillfully and gently taught me how I was wrong. My professor admitted God does change in how God responds to us and deals with us. Because God is in relationship, living relationship with us, and we are temporal, mortal, fallible beings. So all of those scriptural plan changes are tactics that God has for dealing with us. But God does not change in the divine characteristics, the things that make God, God. Aspects like mercy, grace, power. In our epistle from Hebrews, Paul reassures us of this stability at the core of God. Paul writes, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Which means that through all of those shifts in tactics, the core of God is stable and unchanging. It means that the love and the grace that define God are ever pulling us into deeper relationship. Reconciliation and salvation are always God's goal. That line in Hebrews, the Greek word for same is autos, which more accurately means, or is translated as itself. It's a personal pronoun. So literally what Paul wrote is, Jesus is always Jesus. Jesus Christ is Jesus yesterday, Jesus today, and Jesus in the future. God is always God. Paul is stressing that we can count on this constancy. We can rely on a God that is always seeking us, calling us, pulling us toward God and towards God's mission. In fact, the love and the grace of God are so unchanging that we can rely on that constancy as a grounding, as a sure footing that allows us to wholeheartedly take the leap of following the Spirit in all of its new ways of worship and community that it leads to. I think all of our texts today point at some underlying truth, which is the measure of a Christian community is deep hospitality. We see this both in the illustration that Jesus gives in Luke's gospel and in Paul's list of instructions to the Christian community of how to live. In Luke, we have Jesus who, despite speaking in parables and often speaking in what sometimes sounds like code, this morning we hear Jesus being incredibly straightforward about who to invite or not and why. Jesus says, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the dead. At the resurrection of the righteous. I want you to think for a moment. Who do you wish would come through that door and join us for worship here? Who are you worried might step through that door? What are your first thoughts about the kind of person you hope joins us at St. Paul's? Why do you hold those thoughts? Is there any social or cultural conditioning that tells you what kinds of people are desirable or valuable? With this in mind, I want to look at our letter from Paul one last time. Paul instructs us to be hospitable to all strangers, because these strangers might be angels. Paul's referring to Abraham and Sarah inviting angels into their tent, and countless other times in the Old Testament where people unknowingly welcome messengers of God into their midst. And Paul is not only telling us to be hospitable, but also that we need to have extreme empathy. We need to imagine ourselves being tortured alongside those who suffer the most. This is extremely hard. It's a really tall order. But we don't do this alone. We have that constant core of God, that reliability, that unchanging love and grace of God that is constantly seeking us into relationship with it. And that reliable constancy of love means that we can weather all kinds of changes. We can handle discomfort. We can handle and stay together when we're being stretched. And ultimately, we can join Paul with confidence in saying, "The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid."